Hello and welcome. My name's Jake, and I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. Today's quick disclaimer is Microsoft Ignite is just a couple weeks away, and there's going to be a ton of announcements for Azure Stack HCI this year at Ignite, but I don't think any of them are really going to impact what I'm showing you here today. So I want to start with an overview of the architecture and how some of these pieces fit together, and then we're going to hop into the demo. So the first thing that's important and what really sets this apart from remote desktop services is that the AVD control plane lives in the Azure cloud. That's going to handle web access, gateway, connection broker, diagnostics, monitoring, and just about everything else as a service. This service does have a cost, and we'll go over that in a minute here. But while the control plane only runs in the Azure cloud, you can choose to deploy session hosts on the Azure cloud or Azure Stack HCI on-prem. For this video, we're of course focusing on the ability to deploy the session hosts on-prem, but depending on the use case, you could have pools on-prem in your main data center, pools in the Azure cloud, and a pool at a branch office or DR site to meet your use case. So the clients can be fully remote without a need for VPN, and you don't need any public IPs open on-prem. Your session host will need to be able to talk out over 443 to Azure, and then Azure will handle tunneling a connection from the client to the session host. Or, if your clients are on-prem, you can use a feature called RDP Short Path. That's still going to talk to the Azure portal to broker the connection, but then the actual RDP connection will go directly over your internal network, cutting down on latency significantly. So how much does it cost? Well, that gets a bit complicated. If you're covering the AVD cluster under data center with software assurance, which we call hybrid benefit, then there is no host or Windows Server guest fees or CAL requirements. If you aren't going to cover the cluster with data center and software assurance, the Stack HCI host OS fee is $10 per physical core per month. And if you wanted to use Windows Server instead of Windows 11 for your session host, you'd have to license those as well. Earlier I said that the AVD control plane is an Azure service and it has a cost, and here's where that comes into play. The AVD on HCI cost is 1 cent per virtual core per hour, but there are multiple ways to keep this cost down. The first is to use Azure Autoscale, and that's going to be able to power on and off the session hosts as needed. So if you've got a whole bunch of people working 8 to 5 at 6 p.m., all those sessions are gone, it's going to shut down session hosts so that you aren't being charged that 1 cent per virtual core per hour on those machines. The second is to use Windows 11 multi-session. With multi-session, you can have multiple users on the same Windows 11 VM, reducing both the vCPU and RAM overhead. This is obviously going to be use case dependent, but it's not uncommon for me to see 8 to 10 users sharing an 8-core virtual machine without noticing a performance difference from a single session 4-core VM. Actually, one of our customers that I just talked to is running 1,000 peak daily users on their cluster, and they're getting billed about $1,200 a month because they are using multi-session and auto-scale. There's also user rights. For 99% of you, that's going to be covered under your M365, E3, E5, A1, A3, A5, F3 licensing. But if you don't fall under that, there are other options. There's obviously lots of pieces here, and this intro is getting really long. So if you have questions on this, need help, you want to get an estimate on what your cost would be, just reach out and we'll give you help. So with that, let's jump into it. So first thing here is going to be prerequisites. For the most part, pretty straightforward. You're going to need a fully set up and ready to go cluster and a image that you can use for a VD. In this case, we're going to be using Windows 11 multi-session. So if we go to VM images here, you'll be able to see we do in fact have a Windows 11 multi-session image. Actually, I've got a couple of them. So that means we can hop back to the overview and deploy some AVD. Now this part of the AVD deployment wizard is going to be exactly the same as deploying a pool on Azure. Kind of select a resource group, give it a name. The location is really just the metadata. This isn't actually where these session hosts are located. And you can do desktop or remote app pools. For what I want to show in this demo, we're going to go with desktop. But remote app is really helpful if you've got like a legacy ERP system that you just want to give that ERP application in a secured way with low latency to the server out to clients anywhere without giving them a full desktop where they could save something or who knows what else. And then you can do pooled or personal. Uh, Most of the time, it ends up being pooled. People are going to share these hosts, but there is some times where I've seen people go personal for things like CAD and video editing where like they just need a really powerful dedicated VDI session for themselves instead of sharing with other people. But pooled is going to let us do multi-session where we can really see those savings on the per core costs. Now, there's two load balancing algorithms for how users get placed on hosts. There's breadth first and depth first. If you're going to be doing auto scaling, you probably want to be doing depth first so that it's going to fill up session hosts before moving on and putting users on the next one. If you're not going to do auto scale, then generally going to look at breadth first to evenly distribute the users across those session hosts. Now, if you do depth first, you're going to want to make sure you've got a good max session limit here to tell it when to start moving users onto the next session host. If you're doing breadth first, this max session limit doesn't matter so much. It's really more of a safety net like, hey, if we get more than 16 users on one of these hosts, every one of them is going to suffer. So we want to cap it there so that even if not all of our users are getting in, we're at least getting some in a usable environment. Now, this next page on virtual machines here, this is where you're actually going to see a difference between deploying on Azure or deploying on Azure Stack HCI. So deploying on Azure, you've got your virtual machine region, availability zones, and you're going to end up selecting a size based on those normal Azure VM sizes. Deploying on Azure Stack HCI, it's going to be a little different. You're going to select the cluster you want to deploy it on, and then an image from that cluster. And instead of setting a size, you're going to set how many vCPUs, how much RAM. So for this deployment, I'm going to go with 6 cores and 16 gigabytes of RAM. And for this demo, I'm just going to deploy one VM, but you can deploy many VMs at once. No need to deploy one at a time. And I'm going to give these a name. and you're going to put a name in here, and then it's going to add on numbers at the end when it actually deploys those VMs, so there isn't any naming overlap. And we're going to put it on a network here. And we do want to join Active Directory. Joining Entra ID is not available yet for Stack HCI deployments of AVD. So I'm going to fill that in quick. And then we're going to give it a local administrator account to use. Now, it is generally advised to add it to a workspace. Now, this can get a little bit complicated the first couple times you're going to deploy AVD until you understand the relationships that these different objects have. So, we're deploying the session hosts. They're going into a host pool. We're going to get to application groups in a minute here, but there is the idea of workspaces. So workspaces are going to be the container in the Azure Virtual Desktop app that things are organized into for the user. So the user can have multiple workspaces, and a workspace can have multiple host pools and application groups in them, but an application group can only be in one workspace. So this can be used as an organizational thing to help your users understand potentially where and when you should use things. So if you had uh, two ERP systems, uh, maybe you want to bundle those both into one workspace for your users. But if you had uh, multiple sub-organizations, you might actually want to have a workplace per sub-organization, and then the different applications for those sub-organizations in the workspaces. And some people would only belong to one organization and have one workspace, but some people might work for multiple of the sub-organizations and have multiple workspaces sorted out that way. For this, I am going to create a new workspace. And this one's just going to be AVD Demo 1. I've already talked about tags in a previous video. I'm not going to cover them here. And validation passed. So we're going to go ahead and create, which is going to deploy this. But if you wanted, you can, of course, get the template for automation, and you can script out deployment of these resources like everything else in Azure. So I'm going to let this deploy, and I'll be back in a second. All right, so this deployment's all complete, and now we can go to the pool that it created. And here on the overview, you can see that it deployed one machine, and it's ready to be connected to, and one application group and application. So going over to the application group, we can see that it created a default desktop application group because we selected desktop, and it's called DAG. That's the desktop application group. If we had selected it as a remote app pool instead of a desktop pool, we'd be able to go through, select applications from the host pool, and it actually does some really cool stuff. Like you can pull any applications from the start menu just out of a list here, and it'll add them. But like I said, for this demo, we're sticking with the desktop group. So we want to click in there and add an assignment. Of course, we always want to do things by groups if we can. And for this, I've got the AVD demo group that I created with a handful of demo users in the group. So I'm going to add that. And then we're going to be switching out of the portal over to the Azure Virtual Desktop application. All right, so here we've got the Azure Virtual Desktop app on the left and the new Windows app on the right. Both of them work perfectly fine to connect to Azure Virtual Desktop. And you can see that both of them have both my old pool, being ABDS WS, and the new demo pool we created today, JT1 AVD Demo 1. So with either of these, we're able to click connect and they'll join, but this whole demo was about multi-session. So I've gone ahead and spun up 4 demo users, and I'm actually connecting to them through web browsers. So let me switch over to that. All right, so here I've got my 4 demo users signed into the web client for Azure Virtual Desktop, and we're going to get them all connected to the same session host here. And then I put together a couple of basic web browser tests to give a look and feel of what performance in multi-session versus single session looks like. So the first one here is going to be speedometer. So speedometer is a general web browser test. Tests a bunch of different things like JavaScript and some other stuff built into the web browsers. It is a heavily CPU bound test. So I'm going to pull up Task Manager on just one of these because it's going to be the same on all 4 sessions here because it is the same host. And as you can see, it is 6 cores like we had set in the deployment of this VM. One minor note, this is, one of the lowest end 4th gen Xeon Silvers. Base clock speed's only 2 gigahertz, so this isn't representative of a normal deployment. This is just meant to show what does multi-session versus single session look like for performance. And I'm going to try and get these all started as close as possible. And pull that up, and you can see it is hitting the CPU 100% for this test. Now I did run this on a couple of other systems here. So once we get this done, I will pull those up. All right, so we've got all 4 done in the 6.7 to 7.1 range. Now this is all 4 of them sharing 6 cores, so roughly 1.5 cores per user under this full load. And you can see here on a 3-core VM, I was able to hit 10.7, and on a 6-core VM, I was able to hit 12.1. So if we run just one of these again, we're going to end up getting really close to that 12.1 number, if not hitting it. And this makes sense when you're looking at, hey, okay, with all 4 of these maxing it out, of course we saw some performance hit, but for just one client going, we're hitting under that 50% mark. The chances of every user in a session hitting something as hard as they can, in most use cases, not super likely. In reality, probably get one client that'll do something hard for a little bit while the others sit around typing up an email in Outlook or something. So you can see without all 4 of them going, it actually performed really well, significantly better than the user that just had 3 cores dedicated to themselves. And then the next thing I wanted to show was actually not CPU based. This next benchmark is the WebGL Aquarium. Because one of the other considerations is, do you need a GPU? And that's not something I can just answer for you. It's going to depend on what exactly you're running. But here you can see with 4 users at 500 fish, we are starting to see a bit of a dip because we're over 100% on that GPU. Now this is an A2. It's one of the smallest GPUs that work for Virtual Desktop, and it's last generation. So in reality, may not be using this GPU at all. Could see much better performance, but you can see they're running just fine. Hitting around that 25 to 30 FPS mark for a visually demanding web application. Now, if we compare that to this other VM I had spun up without a GPU, you can see even with a single user, and we'll even drop it down to 100 here, it's not doing so well. And it's maxing out that CPU, trying to do 100 for a single person, while these 4 people doing 100, we're at about 60-70% CPU. So GPUs do cost a decent bit of money, but depending on the workload, they can significantly reduce CPU usage. We're happy to talk about all of that with you to figure out if that makes sense. In some cases it will, in some cases it won't. We'll have to talk to you to figure out if that makes sense. So I'm hoping this gave you a good overview of how Azure Virtual Desktop works on HCI and what you can do with it. Obviously, there's a lot more that we can talk about and a lot more you can do with Azure Virtual Desktop on HCI. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Happy to have a chat with you about it. If there's something else you want to see, let me know. I've got a couple more videos planned, and I do demos about this stuff every day of the week. So don't be afraid to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks, and have a great day.